Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special legal compliance update run by Kaizen Synergy Law Firm. My name is Nihal Samra. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen Synergy. I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. This session specifically focuses on a recent legal compliance update and also policy position of the Victims of Crime Charter. Today's session, we're going to be looking specifically at the funded agency reporting requirements. We're going to be looking at what systems, processes, and policy requirements are required for agencies, and also look at resources and systems for yourselves to actually look to utilize as well. My name is Nihal Samara, and if you have any questions, by all means ask away. We will be recording this session and it will be made available in your e-learning library to support your staff and agency as well. We will also be taking questions at the end of the session as well. So if you have specific items that you want to raise, by all means do so. And any questions will also be posted anonymously back into our knowledge base to support all agencies across the sector. As always, we'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly. As I've mentioned, just a few housekeeping items. By all means, ask any questions that you do have in the chat group as we go through. All this webinar information, including these slides, will also be circulated back both on your Gemba notice board and also in your e-learning module as well too. And this will include, as I've mentioned, these materials as well as the relevant legislation too. A knowledge base has also been set up as well, so that way any questions being asked will also be circulated back to all attendees as well. So let's have a look at the specific legal update around the victims of crime. And the agenda today is to look at the responsibilities for your agency and also, where required, submission requirements to the Victims of Crime Commissioner. So really, by the purpose of this webinar and also by attending this webinar, you will get a timely collection of resources that provide an overview of information that should be helpful to your agency, clients, and also the clients you provide services to. The background of the Victims of Crime Commissioner regulations commenced on the 30th of June, and there has been some subsequent policy updates which we will cover off. This effectively prescribes agencies for the purposes of Section 28(1) of the Victims of Crime Act. This is for organisations that are prescribed under the legislation. So prescribed agencies that are funded by the Department of Health and Human Services are required to demonstrate certain compliance obligations with the Victims of Crime Charter and the principles contained within it. And we are actually going to go through this step by step in today's slides. And this resource, as I've mentioned, will also be made available, and it is being recorded all the way up to the question and answer part of the session. So the Victims of Crime Commissioner will be reviewing information about the systems, policies, and processes that organisations currently have in place to ensure compliance with the Victims of Crime Charter. With it, part of this is to get a clear awareness of what your legal compliance obligations are under the Victims of Crime Charter that you can see on the left. The Victims of Crime Commissioner is seeking two tranches of information. The first is by 31st of August, and I'm going to go through this with you today around the specific 8 tick boxes document that has been circulated around. And also by the 14th of September, agencies are asked to provide supporting information and documentation about systems, policies, and processes that your organization either has in place or is developing to ensure compliance with the Charter. And considering the public health emergency that is going on at the moment, we have looked to provide specific compliance entries, which, and a demonstration of one will show you what this looks like, how to meet it, and what we're actually going to set up to ensure that you meet the key requirements across each of the given areas. So a lot of the funded agencies would have received a document that looks like this. And effectively, it's the appendix document that was sent out by the Victims of Crime Commissioner. And with it, there are 8 specific questions to look at answering. These check boxes are yes or no type questions, but also there are question 4, which talks about other policies, training, and the likes. And I'm actually just going to go through this to put this into context and cover this information off. So firstly, and literally each of the following slides that we're going to cover off from 1 through to 8 will actually address each of these questions literally step by step for you. So the first question is your organization aware of the Victims of Charter 2006 and what is it about? So really, the Charter sets out the principles for the way the criminal justice systems and victim service agencies must act when dealing with victims of crime. This means that if a person is a victim of a crime, they can be expected to be treated with courtesy, respect, and dignity. This specific area is covered within the purposes of the Charter, which talks about recognizing principles and that govern the responses to persons adversely affected by crime by investigating agencies, prosecuting agencies, and victim service agencies. I will just add here that what we are going to focus on is the compliance obligations specifically focused on victims services agencies rather than investigatory agencies or prosecuting agencies like the DPP, for example. So the compliance obligations we're really going to look at is focused specifically around the victims of service agencies. The purpose of this is to establish requirements for the monitoring and review of the principles set out in the Act. Now, the Act itself, which we will come to, covers a range of key principles. But again, some of these actually are more relevant or applicable to either investigatory agencies or prosecuting agencies rather than just the victim service agencies like many of yourselves are. So the objects of the Charter, just to be quite clear on your organization is aware of what the Victims Charter actually is. The objects of the Charter is to effectively recognize the impact of crime on the victims of that crime, to recognize that all persons adversely affected by the crime, regardless of whether they report the offence, but how they should be treated as well too, to recognize that a victim of crime has an inherent interest in the response by the criminal justice system. And in this case, what we are focused on is your agency's role within the criminal justice system. Now, let's be quite clear going through it. If it is focused on the victim service agency aspect of this at this time. It is also to look at reducing the likelihood of secondary victimization by the criminal justice system and how this can be done. So with it, those are the key parts of your organization being aware of what the Charter actually is. And as I stress, what we are looking at here is the victim service agencies specifically. Now, with this, for your organization to be aware of what its obligations are under the Charter, effectively the powers is found under Part 3. So when we talk about, well, what are your obligations? We need to go one step further and go, well, what are the implementation of the Charter powers? Where is that found? So under Part 3 of the Charter, it talks about implementation of Charter principles. And it talks about, again, the 3 specific agencies, one of which is the Victim Service Agency is aware or should be reasonably aware that a person is a victim, the agency must have regard to the Charter principles when dealing with that person specifically. So that's the powers of the Charter itself. And it's being able to demonstrate that you're aware of what the Charter principles are. The actual, I'm going to say, the specific areas around investigating and prosecuting requirements is part of outside the scope for specific service agencies like yourselves. So when we then go back and look at, well, what is the obligations under the Charter? And this is found under Part 2. And it is a numbered list of 1 through to 17. Now, some of this information as well too, in terms of what we're looking at, is that this is where we have started to support agencies by effectively setting up key requirements and a checklist process within your compliance calendar. So these are the obligations generally across the Charter itself. It talks of treatment of persons adversely affected to crime. It talks of information to be given to persons adversely affected by crime. There are some areas, for example, if we look at 9, where it talks about the DPP to give reasons for certain decisions. So with it, for many service agencies, there are some here that is good for you to be aware of, but in terms of compliance obligations, it's something that is outside scope because it's covered by another part of the agency. But again, being aware of what these general Charter obligations are. So what we have done for agencies is this. We have effectively taken out, and this is to meet just the yes or no part of the question of the audit, but effectively moving forwards, what we have done is taken apart each of the specific Charter obligations, having this placed into your compliance calendar. And effectively what it's broken down into is looking at the treatment of persons adversely affected by crime, looking at what the requirement actually is. So how can you demonstrate the requirement of all persons adversely affected by crime are treated with courtesy, respect, and dignity by investigating agencies, prosecuting agencies, and victim service agencies. Now, what we have is a question of going through an audit process of how is this done? What is the policy, system, or process? And that's generally what agencies need to do in terms of a quality process. What we have done is effectively got a policy template ready for agencies to use. So you can have a look at this in your compliance calendar, and we'll just check to make sure that yourselves are comfortable for us to load these in. You've got the policy template that will ask you the questions that basically allows you to fill in the blanks. So at our agency, for example, persons adversely affected by crime are treated with courtesy, respect, and dignity by our service agency by the following. So effectively, you can actually complete the blanks around this, and it gives you this process to effectively follow. So by effectively the 31st of August, you've got the ability to actually say, yes, we've got these systems in places. And we've done this across each of the 17 specific items here. Also, where there are recognition of specific areas around additional information, for example, number 7, additional information regarding prosecution to be provided by the DPP. Now, it's good for service agencies to be aware of this, but this is a responsibility of the DPP to also provide this. Now, we don't have members of the DPP joining us today, so effectively we're focused on what is the specific service agency. So it gives you effectively a 17-point compliance calendar check to say, well, what are the systems we've got in place to effectively do this? Now, with it, each of these items have been loaded into your are going to be loaded into your compliance calendar. We're going to check to make sure that yourselves are ready. So going on to part 3 of the question, it looks at part 3 of the checklist. It talks about, has your organization got systems, processes, or policies in place to ensure its compliance with the Charter? Now, the compliance obligations with the Charter will vary depending on, obviously, focusing on service agencies. So effectively what we have done is set up this in 4 places for you to meet your requirements. The first one is to circulate these materials along with the presentation of this webinar to all exec managers. Allow you to have your compliance calendar entries in for review of your policies and templates, which we'll supply to you, one of which is an overarching policy template that covers your general services across your agency. Also, the recordings of these webinars, there are 2. There is one that we're recording right now, and this one here. And there's also a specific one around the charter of those individual items that again is loaded into your e-learning library. The last one that we've also got is a register for receiving complaints or inquiries from victims of crime. Now, this was an important one for agencies, and under 19A and 19B, it talks about how does your agency receive complaints or inquiries from victims of crime. Now, what we have set up for agencies around this as well too, and this is on the Gemba dashboard, and this is our test dashboard, and yourselves can actually access this test dashboard by simply going in. You can use the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 login around this, and this takes you in to this dashboard here, and it is effectively the test dashboard that we use for a lot of our sessions. With it, we've got the checklist tool. Now, this we've looked at specifically the legislation of what is covered under the 19A and 19AB requirements of the Charter itself. And with it, let me just show you what that actually looks like. And bringing this up, this is the Charter requirements. Now, what the Charter actually asks, one of the things that the Charter actually asks you to do, if we go to 19A and 19AB, it talks about specifically the requirements for your agency to have a reporting process in place for actually inquiries around people making complaints about the process, complaints for system for victims, and let me just make this bigger for yourselves to see. So it says complaint system for victims. Each investigative agency, prosecuting agency, victims of service agencies must institute and operate a system to receive and resolve complaints for victims in respects to the agency's requirements. It talks about how you're going to be accessible and transparent, what actions have you taken, and what measures to show that it's been fair and reasonable remedies. As well, it goes into saying, have you actually informed the person that they have the right to complain against the victim to the Victims of Crime Commissioner if they are dissatisfied with the agency's response to the claim. Now, this is specifically focused for, as I said, service agencies, and obviously if there is a complaint received or inquiry received, how do you manage that? Now, what we do have and what we have set up for yourselves is this form here. We call it the 19A and 19AB Victims Charter Complaint Form. And effectively what we have done, and you can either use this or you can actually take the copy of this, but what it gives you is a template to effectively use. Effectively, what we have done is look at the specific legislation, and it says complaint made under 19A or 19A or 19B of the Victims of Crime Charter. It gives you the reference of 19A1, which talks about the requirement. And if we go side by side with this, just to be quite clear around this, here we are here. And if we go side by side around this for you as well too, and I'll just bring this here. Effectively, it talks about the name of the person making the complaint that you need to follow. It talks about specifically the being accessible and transparent and the contact information. It also then talks about specifically how have you offered fair and reasonable remedies. So what we've done here is to ensure you meet that, effectively say, when a person completes it, you've got the date, you've got the time that they've done it, you've got information about the complaint, you've got the requirement on how is the agency being accessible and transparent. It's a free text field, so that way it forces your program managers or staff to actually address it. And also, what are the steps that your agency has taken to ensure fair and reasonable remedies as well. It also then goes down further, and to make sure you meet the second part of 19B, to say, has the agency informed the person making the complaint that they have the right to view the victim's right with the Victims of Crime Commissioner as well. We've also placed in here for this to be reviewed by a program manager as well too, and comments and obviously date that it was completed as well. Now, importantly around this as well, what this gives you is the ability to also, if I go back in once the form is saved, and this is just one we saved this morning to show you how this works, what it also gives you is the ability to save evidence into here as well. So if there was issues like someone wrote in a letter to you making a complaint, or there was you contacted the DPP or you contacted somebody and you wanted to load an email or evidence of what you've actually done to support the person, well, again, you can actually click on this and it'll actually bring up the evidence, and you can actually load your evidence against this as well. So I'm showing you around this because this form is literally ready to go and rolled out for yourselves as well. If you want, you can simply print this out and you can run this as well. It'll obviously, because it's on Gemba, give you the audit logs. Now, from a privacy point of view, obviously that's going to be a big question that'll come up, I'm sure, in the questions. From a privacy point of view as well, which are with this, from a privacy point, you can set this to specific program areas as well. So you can actually set a group, which are the specific groups or teams in your agency that are responsible for this. One question that we've just been asked is the question that none seems to be able to answer is exactly which agencies are prescribed entities as per the Act. Are they agencies funded to provide the Victims of Crime program, or does it include any agency that provides services to people who may or may not be victims of crime? That's a really good question around this. We have looked at, when we've looked at the legislation around this, it talks about services, service agencies that are involved in providing services to victims of crime. So it is a fairly, and that's why we've actually taken some time to actually run this session around this to gather some of this information together. And part of this is around looking at the broader application of how this works. We've looked at, when we talk about who is actually involved in the criminal justice and service support program. So if the person is a victim of a crime, what we are looking at this stage is that it includes agencies that might provide services to people who may or may not be victims themselves. So with it, that's why we've actually, and it's a really good question, that's why we've actually taken a very broad approach to this compliance parcel of work. In doing that, setting up, and I'll just go back to even the compliance questions that we have set for this as well too. Let me just go back, is to look at, for service agencies, looking at the specific charter, dividing this up and actually saying, well, how does this actually work specifically in the community health services sector. If it is around providing services to people that are involved, I'm going to say in family violence, domestic violence, clearly they're a victim of crime around that. There may be broader around drug and alcohol services, support services, NDIS services. So could actually be quite broad around this. So this is why some of the responses, for example, to even question 1, treatment of persons adversely affected by crime, well, generally a lot of the community health services will have already policies in place that cover a lot of these requirements. So what we've done here is actually take quite a broad approach, look at a handful of key policies that talks about the charter, that says the agency acknowledges the charter and the Victims of Crime Charter, acknowledges the requirements and audit requirements of the Victorian Crimes Commission, has a form to effectively address these questions and inquiries as well. But let's be quite clear, this is around being quite broad in terms of the services that are being delivered. So that's why we've actually, in this case, taken quite a broad approach. The broad approach also sits, I'm going to say, consistently with the view of some of the recent royal commissions as well too, taken by Parliament, whether we look at aged care, NDIS, religious services, schools programs. So a lot of the commissions and inquiries that have been going on, they have at the moment, Parliament seems to be taking quite a broad approach to which agencies are supported within this space. So that's where we've actually looked at this charter, given a broad approach to this, but not drilling down into some of the micro detail around this, but making sure that agencies can effectively answer the Victorian Crime Commissioner's questions, but equally have a policy process in place that informs staff around it and have some overarching policies that address these requirements, which we'll send across. And so part of this was to do it in effectively 4 ways. We're looking at the systems, and they talk about the systems, processes, or policies. Rather than having a policy for every single charter requirement, we've come up with an overarching policy so that your agency meets those requirements. Having a general training for staff around the charter obligations as well too. Again, that's a secondary session that we're running apart from this one as well. Systems to internally monitor staff compliance. Well, that's from your compliance calendar as well too, but also the register for receiving complaints or inquiries should you do so as well. So you've got those 4 processes in place. In terms of going back to the document and the yes or no checklist, what we've done here is look at each one of those. So just covering those off, it talks about in question 5, does your organization have a place for developing policies, processes, systems, training to ensure compliance with the charter? And again, what we've divided this into is repeating this in 5 separate areas. One is around the policy templates for the GEMBA docs. And as I said, there's 2 specific ones that we're circulating out to agencies around this. One is an overarching charter to inform you about what is required from an organizational level and an executive management level. The second is just obligations under those 17 key criteria, and where they're not relevant, then effectively agencies can record that in that document. So it's effectively a fill in the answer type of process. Equally, the compliance calendar will give you that systems process around each of those 17 areas. The e-learning will give you the training for staff just to complete around that. And you've also got the victims of crime form as well. Equally, it also talks about, as part of the checklist, is your organization aware of the Victims of Crime Commissioner? Now, to answer that, effectively, we put that into a policy document to circulate around to executive managers and staff. So effectively, it talks about the Victims of Crime Commissioner promotes the recognition, inclusion, participation of victims of crime within the justice system itself. And obviously around that, specific contact details as well. The last few things around 7.7 and 8, it talks about from your agency's legal compliance obligations, and again, picking up Sue's question around, is your organisation aware of around the specific broader context around this? What we're looking at here is your organisation aware of the Commissioner's responsibility for reporting on compliance for prescribed agencies with the Charter? And so what we've done here, as I've mentioned before, is to look at the relevant key parts of the legislation that are at most relevant to yourselves. And this is under 19A and also 19B. And it talks about each investigative agency or prosecuting agency, victim service agencies must institute and operate a system to receive and resolve a complaint. But what does that actually look like? And as I've mentioned as well too, again, Part 8 also talks about receiving individual issues around non-compliance. And so what we've set up, as I mentioned around this, is simply a form for yourselves to use. And this can be just pushed out live onto your system as well for yourselves to have a look at. It's not something to act on immediately, but it is something that is right there for yourselves to use. And whether you use this or something else, you can use this as almost a template to show what systems you've got in place as well. Now, moving towards the 14th of September, effectively, it talks about providing documentation on question 4, which we've included in these slides, on the systems, processes, or policies in place, and provide evidence on this, which I've already showed you, and also provide documentation to point 5, which was the point 5 question, of the plan for developing policies, processes, systems, and training to ensure compliance with the Charter. Now, please, it talks about providing a timeline for the establishment of these processes. And what we have, as I said, set up for yourselves is around providing you 2 overarching policies that cover your requirements as part of a general service agency. You've got your compliance calendar entries, which is around the broader application for funded agencies. And again, it's really commensurate based on the services that your agency delivers around it as well. The other part is around the training and the e-learning resource that's available. And that can be, let's be quite clear around this, it talks about by the 14th of September, what is the processes to actually have in place and what the timelines are for establishment of this. Now, if we need to extend these out, then we can, but at least we've got the processes around this for what you need to effectively look at. Now, effectively what we are covering under this all staff training around this is that you can effectively cover information around the victims of crime and effectively what is covered under the victim of crime information as well. And again, as part of the webinar that we're running around this, then effectively you have the processes and the session to inform staff as well. As I've mentioned, the forms that we've placed on Gemba is there as a reference purposes. You can certainly use other client record systems, other forms and documents you may use as well too. And again, you can effectively run other systems. We've used this as a template that allows you to collect this information around some of those key requirements. And that can be switched on for yourselves to have a look at and then switched off at a later stage. So really it allows you to manage these in a multiple number of ways. It's there for yourselves to utilize as well. So as part of the recommendations out of today, a number of things that we have just listed out. Firstly, we will be circulating this set of slides to all the management group across agencies so that they're across their key reporting requirements. Along with this webinar as well too, will also be made available this afternoon. To complete the request for information, as I mentioned, is the document that was sent by the Victorian the Victims of Crime Commissioner as well too, and effectively that 8-point checklist can be confirmed by following these items on this legal update webinar, and also the materials that we'll post on your legal update notice board as well too today. We do have a series of policy templates, 2 specific policy templates. One is an overarching charter around it for your agencies, and it's more of a broad brush document for your agency to adopt. The second actually includes the specific list of the charter obligations and what that means for your agency. Idea is that we actually took it as a overarching policy template. And just to be clear, it was a Victims of Crime Charter policy, and then effectively the charter obligations we've made as a procedure document as well. What that gives you and why we've separated out as a policy and a procedure is that way, if it's a procedure, most of your agencies can change that as you need to. So it allows that for people as well. The compliance calendar audits, with permission, we'll actually send that across to you, and we'll be in touch today around that. And that effectively gives you the 17 items to actually look at as well too. And of course, you've got the Victims of Crime Charter form that allows you to mark those off as well. The e-learning module for all staff as well too is available in your e-learning dashboard, and that is available for yourselves to start to utilize as well, and it can be also switched on for yourselves. So it allows you to effectively run those training and make it available to staff. It's a short 5-minute session that allows you, and it really supports this session as well too, that supports why they're actually doing it and the key points around it for yourselves as well. So effectively, we will just open the phone lines, and happy to stay on the line and answer any questions that people might have. Just as we are doing that, if you do have any questions after today's session, by all means, please contact us on 1300 360 360, or you can email us at support@gemba360.com.